Wife discovers dead husband living in attic for 10 years. What she does with a teaspoon changes the family forever. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, an elderly widow's world is turned upside down when she discovers her supposedly deceased husband hiding in their attic. Armed with nothing but a teaspoon and decades of unspoken secrets, she must confront a past that refuses to stay buried and a future hanging by a thread. As shadows of government conspiracies loom and long-lost loyalties are tested, this extraordinary couple embarks on a heart-pounding journey that will challenge everything they thought they knew about love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of "till death do us part." On a crisp autumn morning in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., 68-year-old Margaret Holloway shuffled through her empty house, the silence broken only by the creaking of weathered floorboards beneath her slippered feet. 10 years had passed since she'd become a widow, but the weight of solitude still pressed heavily upon her shoulders. Margaret's wrinkled hands clutched a steaming mug of chamomile tea as she made her way to the living room. Family photos adorned the walls, frozen moments of a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. Her gaze lingered on a portrait of her late husband, Robert. His kind eyes and gentle smile were a stark contrast to the stern-faced man she remembered from his final years. As she settled into her favorite armchair, a familiar sound caught her attention. A faint thud from above, like footsteps in the attic. Margaret's heart quickened. She'd heard similar noises over the years, but had always dismissed them as the house settling or perhaps a raccoon that had found its way inside. But this time was different. The sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be explained away. With trembling hands, Margaret set down her mug and rose from her chair. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Taking a deep breath, Margaret steeled herself and made her way to the hallway. She reached up and tugged on the cord that released the attic ladder. As it creaked open, dust motes danced in the shaft of light that spilled down from above. Margaret's arthritic knees protested as she climbed the ladder, her heart pounding in her chest. The musty smell of the attic filled her nostrils as she poked her head through the opening. Her eyes, adjusting to the dimness, scanned the cluttered space. And then, in the far corner, she saw him. A figure huddled behind a stack of old boxes, barely visible in the shadows. But Margaret would recognize that silhouette anywhere. It was a shape etched into her memory, one she'd spent decades waking up next to. "Robert," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure stiffened, then slowly turned to face her. As he stepped into a shaft of light streaming through a dirty window, Margaret gasped. It was indeed Robert, older, grayer, with a wild beard and haunted eyes, but undeniably her husband. "Maggie," he croaked, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm so sorry." Margaret's world tilted on its axis. Her legs gave way, and she sank to her knees on the dusty attic floor. A torrent of emotions washed over her: shock, joy, anger, confusion, each fighting for dominance. Why?" she managed to choke out, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Robert took a hesitant step toward her, his hands raised as if approaching a wounded animal. "I had no choice, Maggie. They were going to hurt you, hurt our family. I had to protect you." As Margaret's mind reeled, trying to make sense of the impossible scene before her, Robert began to speak. He told a tale of government secrets, of a covert operation gone wrong, of powerful enemies who would stop at nothing to silence him. He spoke of a decision made in desperation, to fake his own death and hide in the very home they had shared for decades. "I've been here all along, Maggie," Robert said, his voice breaking, "watching over you, keeping you safe. I wanted to reach out so many times, but I couldn't risk it. Not until now." Margaret listened, her heart torn between the joy of seeing her beloved husband alive and the crushing weight of a decade of lies. As Robert's story unfolded, she found herself transported back in time, remembering the man he had been before his death. Distant, secretive, always looking over his shoulder. Suddenly, a lifetime of unexplained absences and cryptic phone calls clicked into place. The Robert she had mourned was not the man she had married, but a carefully constructed facade. The real Robert, her Robert, had been here all along, a silent guardian in the shadows. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the attic, Margaret made a decision. She rose to her feet, her joints protesting the movement, and looked her husband squarely in the eye. "Robert Holloway," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You have a lot of explaining to do, and we're going to need more than chamomile tea for this conversation." With that, Margaret turned and began to descend the ladder, leaving a stunned Robert in her wake. As she reached the bottom, she paused, looking back up at the man she had thought lost forever. "Well," she called, "are you coming? Or do you plan to spend another decade up there?" Robert, a ghost brought suddenly to life, nodded and began to follow his wife down the ladder. As he stepped into the hallway of his home for the first time in 10 years, the gravity of the situation settled upon them both. Margaret led the way to the kitchen, her mind racing. She had 1,000 questions, a lifetime of grief to process, and no roadmap for how to handle a situation like this. But as she reached for the kettle to brew a fresh pot of tea, her hand brushed against a small teaspoon in the dish rack. She picked it up, turning it over in her palm. It was just a simple utensil, but as she looked at it, an idea began to form. This teaspoon, ordinary as it was, might just be the key to unraveling the extraordinary mystery that had landed on her doorstep. Little did Margaret know that humble teaspoon would soon become an unlikely tool in a dangerous game of cat and mouse, one that would test the limits of her love, her courage, and her ability to forgive. The kitchen was eerily quiet as Margaret and Robert sat across from each other at the worn oak table. Steam rose from their mugs of tea, curling in the air between them like the unspoken words that hung heavy in the room. Robert's hands, once strong and sure, now trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the warmth of his cup. Margaret studied her husband's face, noting the new lines etched by time and worry. His eyes, once a vibrant blue, now seemed faded, carrying the weight of secrets long kept. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. "Start at the beginning," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And don't leave anything out." Robert nodded, his gaze fixed on the table. "It all started 20 years ago," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't just an analyst for the Department of Defense, Maggie. I was part of a covert team, tasked with monitoring potential threats to national security." As Robert spoke, Margaret's mind reeled. She remembered those years, the late nights, the mysterious phone calls, the tension that seemed to follow him home like a shadow. She had attributed it to the stress of his job, never imagining the true depth of his involvement. "We uncovered something big," Robert continued, his voice gaining strength. "A network of corrupt officials, both foreign and domestic, siphoning classified information and selling it to the highest bidder. We had names, dates, proof enough to bring down some very powerful people." Margaret leaned forward, her tea forgotten. "Why didn't you report it? Surely there were proper channels." Robert's bitter laugh cut her off. "The rot went deeper than we realized, Maggie. The very people we were supposed to report to were involved. When we tried to blow the whistle, things escalated." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "2 members of our team died in accidents within a week. Another disappeared without a trace. I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for me, for us." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "The car crash," she whispered. "Your death." Robert nodded grimly. "It was the only way I could think to protect you and the kids. If they believed I was dead, they'd have no reason to come after my family. I had a friend in the coroner's office who helped me fake the records. The casket was empty at the funeral." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as the memories of that painful time flooded back. The shock, the grief, the lonely nights spent wondering how she would go on without him. All of it based on a lie. "How could you do that to us, Robert?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Do you have any idea what we went through?" Pain flashed across Robert's face. "I'm so sorry, Maggie. I wanted to tell you so many times, but the risk was too great. As long as they thought I was dead, you were safe. I couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to you or the children because of me." Margaret stood abruptly, needing to put some distance between herself and the man who had shattered her world twice over. She walked to the kitchen window, gazing out at the familiar neighborhood that suddenly seemed alien. "And all this time you've been, what, living in our attic?" she asked, struggling to wrap her mind around the concept. Robert nodded. "Most of the time. I'd sneak out at night sometimes, gather information, try to find a way to expose the truth without putting you in danger. I watched over you, Maggie, protected you as best I could from the shadows." Margaret turned back to face him, a sudden realization dawning. "The break-in 3 years ago, the burglar they never caught. That was you, wasn't it?" A ghost of a smile played on Robert's lips. "He wasn't a burglar. He was sent to plant surveillance equipment in the house. I convinced him it wasn't a good idea." Despite herself, Margaret felt a flicker of the old admiration she'd always had for Robert's capability. But it was quickly doused by the ocean of hurt and betrayal that roiled within her. "Why now?" she asked, returning to her seat at the table. "Why reveal yourself after all this time?" Robert's expression grew serious. "Because I finally have what I need to end this, Maggie. Proof that can't be buried or ignored. But I can't do it alone. I need your help." Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "My help? Robert, I'm a retired school teacher. What could I possibly do?" Robert leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You're smart, Maggie, resourceful, and most importantly, you're above suspicion. They'll be watching for me, but you're just a widow going about her daily life." As Robert outlined his plan, Margaret's head spun. Coded messages, dead drops, clandestine meetings. It was like something out of a spy novel, not the life of a woman pushing 70. "And how exactly am I supposed to do all this without arousing suspicion?" she asked, skepticism heavy in her voice. Robert's eyes fell on the teaspoon that still lay on the table between them. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "With this," he said, a hint of his old mischievous smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Margaret stared at him, bewildered. "A teaspoon? Robert, have you lost your mind?" "Think about it, Maggie," Robert said, his excitement growing. "It's perfect, innocuous, something you'd carry with you naturally. But with a few modifications, it could be so much more. A tool for leaving messages, a key, even a small storage device." As Robert continued to explain, Margaret found herself torn. Part of her, the part still reeling from the shock and hurt of his deception, wanted to throw him out, to call the police and wash her hands of this madness. But another part, a part she thought long dormant, felt a thrill at the challenge. She looked at her husband, this man she had loved, lost, and found again. Despite everything, she could see the passion in his eyes, the determination to right a wrong that had cost them both so dearly. Margaret took a deep breath, weighing the decision that lay before her. The safe, quiet life she had built for herself in Robert's absence stood on one side. On the other, a dangerous adventure that could change everything. As the clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of time that suddenly seemed so precious, Margaret reached out and took the teaspoon from Robert's hand. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Tell me more about this plan of yours." "But Robert," she fixed him with a stern gaze. "No more lies, no more secrets. From this moment on, we're in this together. Understood?" Robert nodded, relief and gratitude washing over his features. As he began to outline the details of his plan, Margaret listened intently, the teaspoon cool in her palm. Little did she know that this simple utensil would soon become the key to unlocking a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of government, testing her loyalty, her courage, and the very foundations of her marriage. The game was afoot, and Margaret Holloway, retired schoolteacher and newly minted spy, was about to embark on the most extraordinary chapter of her life. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity for Margaret. By day, she maintained her routine as the quiet, unassuming widow that her neighbors had come to know. But in stolen moments, late at night or in the early hours of the morning, she worked alongside Robert, transforming their home into a covert operations center. The attic, once a dusty storage space, now hummed with activity. Robert had managed to accumulate an impressive array of surveillance equipment over the years, and together they set about organizing and upgrading their arsenal. Margaret's steady hands, honed by years of needlework, proved invaluable in manipulating the delicate components. "You're a natural at this, Maggie," Robert said one evening, watching as his wife deftly soldered a microscopic tracking device into the bowl of the infamous teaspoon. Margaret glanced up, a wry smile on her lips. "I suppose those years of helping the kids with their science fair projects weren't wasted after all." As they worked, Robert filled Margaret in on the details of the conspiracy he'd uncovered. The network, which they'd taken to calling the Syndicate, had tentacles reaching into every level of government. Senators, judges, even high-ranking military officials were implicated in a web of corruption that boggled the mind. "But why?" Margaret asked one night, her brow furrowed as she pored over the files Robert had amassed. "What's their endgame?" Robert's face darkened. "Power, mostly. Control. They're manipulating policy, steering defense contracts, influencing elections, all to line their own pockets and shape the world to their liking." Margaret shook her head, disgust evident in her expression. "And to think, all this time I've been baking cookies for the League of Women Voters, thinking I was doing my civic duty." Despite the gravity of their situation, Robert couldn't help but chuckle. "Don't sell yourself short, Maggie. Those snickerdoodles of yours could probably bring down a government if deployed strategically." As the days passed, Margaret found herself slipping into her new role with surprising ease. The skills she'd honed as a teacher, observation, quick thinking, the ability to maintain composure under pressure, translated well to the world of espionage. And the teaspoon, now a marvel of miniaturized technology, became an extension of herself. Their first major operation came on a crisp Saturday morning. Margaret, bundled up against the autumn chill, made her way to the local farmer's market. To anyone watching, she was simply a grandmother picking up her weekly produce. In reality, she was making a dead drop, leaving a data-filled teaspoon in a predetermined location for one of Robert's few remaining allies to collect. As she examined a display of heirloom tomatoes, Margaret's heart raced. She could feel eyes on her, the weight of unseen gazes making the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Forcing herself to remain calm, she completed her purchase and turned to leave. That's when she saw him, a man in a dark suit, out of place among the casual weekend shoppers. His hand was inside his jacket, and Margaret didn't need Robert's years of experience to know he was reaching for a weapon. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Margaret's mind raced, evaluating her options. The crowd offered some protection, but also put innocent lives at risk. She couldn't run. It would only confirm her involvement. No, she needed to brazen it out. Drawing herself up to her full height, all 5 feet 2 inches of it, Margaret marched directly towards the man. As she approached, she stumbled slightly, letting her bag of produce spill onto the ground. "Oh dear," she exclaimed, her voice carrying the slight quaver of age. "I'm so clumsy. Young man, would you be a dear and help an old lady gather her things?" The man hesitated, clearly thrown off balance by this direct approach. His training hadn't prepared him for a little old lady engaging him in conversation. Reluctantly, he bent to help her, his eyes darting around for any sign of a trap. "Thank you so much," Margaret said warmly, taking perhaps a bit longer than necessary to gather her spilled purchases. "You know, you remind me of my grandson. He's about your age, works for the government too. Such important work you all do." The man's eyes widened slightly at this, and Margaret knew she had him. She launched into a long-winded story about her fictional grandson, peppering it with just enough accurate details about government work to make the man second-guess his suspicions. By the time Margaret finished her tale and toddled off, the man was thoroughly confused. He'd been so certain this harmless old woman was his target, but now, he shook his head, deciding he needed to reconfirm his intel before taking any action. As Margaret made her way home, her knees felt weak with relief. She'd done it. She'd faced down a trained operative and come out on top. The adrenaline coursing through her veins made her feel more alive than she had in years. Entering the house, she called out softly, "Robert, we need to talk. I think things just got a lot more complicated." Little did Margaret know, this encounter was just the beginning. The game was escalating, and the stakes were about to get much, much higher. As autumn gave way to winter, Margaret and Robert settled into a tense routine. Their days were filled with careful planning and information gathering. Their nights with hushed conversations and shared worries. The weight of their secret mission hung heavy over the house, turning their once peaceful home into a pressure cooker of anxiety and anticipation. Margaret found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, her eyes constantly scanning for signs of surveillance. The simple act of checking the mail became a covert operation, each trip outside an opportunity for their enemies to strike. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, Margaret and Robert grew closer than they had been in years. The shared purpose, the thrill of their clandestine activities, reignited a spark that had long been dormant in their relationship. One snowy evening, as they huddled over a stack of encrypted documents in the attic, Robert reached out and took Margaret's hand. "I never thought I'd say this, Maggie, but I'm glad you found me up here. I couldn't do this without you." Margaret squeezed his hand in return, a lump forming in her throat. "We always did make a good team, didn't we?" But their moment of tenderness was short-lived. A sharp crack echoed through the night, followed by the tinkling of broken glass. Margaret's blood ran cold as she recognized the sound. A bullet shattering their living room window. "Get down!" Robert hissed, pulling Margaret to the floor. Years of training kicked in as he army crawled to the attic entrance, peering down into the darkened house below. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she followed Robert's lead. This was it, the moment they'd been dreading. The syndicate had found them. "We need to get out of here," Robert whispered urgently. "There's a go bag hidden in the basement. If we can reach it." Margaret nodded, her mind racing. Then an idea struck her. "The teaspoon," she whispered back. "I've got a plan." Before Robert could protest, Margaret was moving. With surprising agility for a woman her age, she shimmied down the attic ladder and made her way to the kitchen, keeping low to avoid the windows. Robert followed close behind, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and admiration for his wife's boldness. "Maggie, what are you doing?" he hissed. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the teaspoon, their secret weapon, and began to work. With trembling fingers, she activated the hidden mechanisms Robert had installed, transforming the innocuous utensil into something far more potent. Outside, they could hear footsteps crunching in the snow, approaching the house from all sides. Time was running out. "Robert," Margaret whispered, pressing the teaspoon into his hand. "Do you trust me?" He nodded without hesitation. "With my life." "Good," she replied, a determined glint in her eye. "Because that's exactly what I'm asking you to do." In a flurry of whispered instructions and hurried movements, Margaret laid out her plan. It was audacious, borderline insane, but it was their only chance. As the front door burst open, Margaret straightened up, schooling her features into an expression of confused fear. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice quavering convincingly. "I'm just a harmless old woman." The intruders, a team of black-clad operatives, swept into the house, weapons at the ready. They found Margaret standing in the kitchen, hands raised, the very picture of a frightened grandmother. "Please," she begged, tears welling in her eyes. "Don't hurt me. I'll tell you everything." The lead operative, a hard-faced woman with cold eyes, stepped forward. "Where is he?" she demanded. "Where's Robert Holloway?" Margaret's lower lip trembled. I don't know what you're talking about. My husband's been dead for years." "Don't play games with us, old woman," the operative snarled. "We know he's alive, and we know he's been hiding here." Margaret let her shoulders slump in defeat. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll show you." With shaking hands, she reached for a drawer and pulled out a photo album. As the operatives tensed, weapons trained on her, Margaret slowly opened the book. "He's been here all along," she said, pointing to a photo of Robert's gravestone. "Right where I buried him." The lead operative frowned, stepping closer to examine the photo. And that's when Margaret made her move. In one fluid motion, she slammed the album shut on the woman's hand and brought her knee up, catching her squarely in the solar plexus. As the operative doubled over, gasping for breath, Margaret snatched the teaspoon from where she'd hidden it and jammed it into the exposed nape of the woman's neck. There was a crackle of electricity, and the operative collapsed to the ground, unconscious. The other intruders, momentarily stunned by this turn of events, hesitated just long enough for Robert to make his move. He burst from his hiding place in the pantry, wielding a fire extinguisher like a club. Between Margaret's teaspoon turn taser and Robert's improvised weapon, they managed to subdue the remaining operatives in a chaotic flurry of action. As the last attacker fell, Margaret and Robert stood in the wreckage of their kitchen, breathing heavily. They looked at each other, equal parts exhilarated and terrified by what they'd just done. "Well," Margaret said, brushing a strand of gray hair from her face, "I suppose we can start a kitchen brawl off our bucket list." Robert let out a shaky laugh, pulling his wife into a tight embrace. "Maggie, you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known." But their moment of victory was short-lived. They both knew that this was only the beginning. The syndicate would send more operatives, and next time they might not be so lucky. As they set about securing their unconscious attackers and gathering what evidence they could, Margaret and Robert shared a look of grim determination. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. With the teaspoon clutched tightly in her hand, their unlikely weapon and key to unraveling the entire conspiracy, Margaret knew that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. The clock was ticking, and the fate of not just their family, but possibly the entire nation, hung in the balance. Little did they know, the information stored in that humble teaspoon would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of power in Washington, D.C. and beyond. The aftermath of the kitchen skirmish left Margaret and Robert with precious little time to catch their breath. They worked quickly, securing their unconscious assailants with zip ties and gathering what intelligence they could from the fallen operatives' communication devices. "We can't stay here," Robert said grimly, his eyes darting to the shattered window. "It won't be long before they realize this team has gone dark." Margaret nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "The go bag in the basement? You said it has everything we need?" "Everything except a plan," Robert replied with a wry smile. "But something tells me you're already working on that." Indeed, Margaret's years as a teacher had honed her ability to think on her feet, and now those skills were being put to the ultimate test. As they hurried to the basement to retrieve the go bag, she outlined her thoughts. "We need to get this information out," she said, holding up the teaspoon that now contained enough evidence to bring down the syndicate. "But we can't trust anyone in official channels. We need to go public, make it impossible for them to sweep this under the rug." Robert's brow furrowed. "That's risky, Maggie. Once we go public, we lose any advantage of secrecy we might have had." "We don't have much choice," Margaret countered. "They know you're alive now. Our only protection is to make this bigger than just us." As they emerged from the basement, go bag in hand, a plan began to take shape. It was audacious, perhaps even foolhardy, but it was the best chance they had. Under the cover of darkness, Margaret and Robert slipped out of their home of 4 decades. As they drove away in Robert's old, nondescript sedan, Margaret couldn't help but cast a glance back at the house that held so many memories. She wondered if she'd ever see it again. Their first stop was a 24-hour copy shop in a seedy part of town. Using the skills Robert had taught her, Margaret created multiple copies of the evidence stored in the teaspoon, encrypting some, leaving others in plain text. They mailed these to trusted journalists, watchdog organizations, and even a few carefully chosen politicians who had reputations for integrity. But this was just the beginning. The real linchpin of their plan relied on something Margaret had learned during her years of teaching: the power of social media. "Are you sure about this?" Robert asked as they sat in the car outside an all-night diner. Margaret hunched over a burner phone. "No," Margaret admitted, "but it's our best shot at getting this information out quickly and widely." With trembling fingers, Margaret created a new social media account under a pseudonym. Then, taking a deep breath, she began to post thread after thread of information, each one a bombshell that would rock the foundations of Washington, D.C. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the city, Margaret and Robert watched in awe as their posts began to gain traction. Retweets, shares, and comments flooded in at an exponential rate. "It's working," Robert breathed, his eyes wide as he scrolled through the responses. "They're listening. They're believing." Margaret allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction, but she knew their work was far from over. "We've lit the fuse," she said. "Now we need to make sure it doesn't fizzle out." Their next move took them to the heart of DC itself. Using disguises from the go bag, Robert now sporting a salt and pepper beard and Margaret wearing a stylish wig, they made their way to the offices of a national news network. "Ready for your close-up, Maggie?" Robert asked as they approached the building. Margaret squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of the teaspoon in her pocket. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. An elderly couple, seemingly ordinary in every way, walked into the newsroom and turned the world of American politics on its head. As Margaret spoke into the camera, her voice steady and clear, she laid out the entire conspiracy. She named names, cited dates, and provided irrefutable evidence, all backed up by the data stored in her seemingly innocuous teaspoon. The reaction was immediate and seismic. Social media exploded, news tickers blared breaking news alerts, and phones across Washington, D.C. began ringing off the hook. But even as Margaret and Robert watched their revelations send shockwaves through the nation, they knew their fight was far from over. The syndicate wouldn't go down without a fight. And now, with nowhere left to hide, Margaret and Robert would have to face the full force of their enemy's wrath. As they left the news studio, slipping out a back entrance to avoid the growing crowd of reporters, Margaret reached for Robert's hand. "Whatever happens next," she said softly, "we're in this together." Robert squeezed her hand in return, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride, love, and determination. "Together," he agreed, "just like always." Little did they know, the storm they had unleashed was about to reach its furious climax, testing their love, their courage, and their faith in each other like never before. The next 48 hours were a blur of activity. Margaret and Robert moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few hours, always looking over their shoulders. They watched from hidden corners and anonymous hotel rooms as their revelations dominated every news cycle, sparking outrage and calls for investigation from all corners of the political spectrum. But with each passing hour, the danger grew. The syndicate, its very existence now exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny, was lashing out with increasing desperation. Reports of mysterious accidents befalling potential whistleblowers began to surface. Key pieces of evidence vanished from secure locations. It was clear that the conspiracy's roots ran deep, and they wouldn't be easily uprooted. "We need to find a safe place," Robert said on the evening of the second day, his face haggard with exhaustion. "Somewhere we can regroup and plan our next move." Margaret nodded, her own fatigue evident in the slump of her shoulders. But there was still a fire in her eyes, a determination that refused to be extinguished. "I think I know just the place," she said. Their destination turned out to be a small, nondescript cabin in the Shenandoah Valley, owned by one of Margaret's former students. As they drove through the winding mountain roads, Margaret explained how she had stayed in touch with the student over the years, mentoring her as she rose through the ranks of the FBI. "Are you sure we can trust her?" Robert asked, his years of paranoia hard to shake. Margaret's response was firm. "With my life, and yours." As they pulled up to the cabin, a figure emerged from the shadows. Agent Sarah Chen, barely recognizable from the earnest young girl Margaret had taught years ago, approached the car with cautious steps. "Mrs. Holloway?" she called out. "Is that really you?" Margaret stepped out of the car, a warm smile breaking through her exhaustion. "Hello, Sarah. It's been a long time." The reunion was brief but emotional. Sarah ushered them inside, her trained eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of threat. Once inside, she turned to face her former teacher and the man she had believed dead for a decade. "I have to admit," Sarah said, "when I saw your broadcast, I thought I was losing my mind. But then I remembered something you taught us, Mrs. Holloway, about how the most extraordinary things can often hide in plain sight." Margaret chuckled softly. "I was talking about grammar rules at the time, but I suppose the principle applies here too." As they settled in, Sarah brought them up to speed on the situation. The FBI was in chaos, with agents unsure who to trust. The evidence Margaret and Robert had released was being verified, but it was a slow process, hampered by interference from those implicated in the conspiracy. "We're at a tipping point," Sarah explained. "If we can provide irrefutable proof, something that can't be denied or covered up, we can bring the whole thing crashing down. But if we fail..." She didn't need to finish the thought. They all knew the stakes. That night, as Robert and Sarah pored over files and made secure calls to trusted allies, Margaret found herself drawn to the cabin's small porch. She stood there, gazing out at the star-filled sky, the teaspoon clutched in her hand like a talisman. She thought about the life she had lived, the quiet years of teaching, the pain of losing Robert, the shock of finding him again. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined she would be here, on the front lines of a battle to save American democracy. A warm hand on her shoulder startled her from her reverie. Robert stood beside her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked softly. Margaret leaned into him, drawing comfort from his presence. "I was just thinking about how strange life can be. All those years I thought I was just a simple teacher, and now you're a hero," Robert finished for her. "You always were, Maggie. To your students, to me. You just needed the right moment to show the rest of the world." Their moment of peace was shattered by a frantic call from inside. "Mr. and Mrs. Holloway." Sarah's voice was tight with urgency. "We've got a problem." Racing back inside, they found Sarah hunched over a laptop, her face pale in the screen's blue glow. "They've found us," she said without preamble. "A team is on their way. We have maybe an hour, tops." The calm that had settled over Margaret evaporated in an instant, but in its place a steely resolve took hold. She looked at Robert, then at Sarah, her mind already formulating a plan. "Then we've got work to do," she said, her voice steady. "Sarah, I need you to get in touch with every trustworthy agent you know. Robert, start prepping our evidence for a mass release." As they sprang into action, Margaret reached for the teaspoon. In this small, unassuming utensil lay the key to their salvation or their downfall. Whatever happened next, she knew it would all come down to this final confrontation. The clock was ticking, the enemy was closing in, and Margaret Holloway, retired teacher turned unlikely spy, was about to face the greatest test of her life. Little did any of them know, the events of the next hour would not only determine their fate but would reshape the very foundations of American power. And at the center of it all, a simple teaspoon would prove to be the most potent weapon in their arsenal. The cabin buzzed with frantic activity as Margaret, Robert, and Sarah prepared for the impending confrontation. Outside, the peaceful night had taken on a sinister quality, every rustle of leaves and crack of a twig a potential harbinger of danger. Margaret stood at the heart of the storm, her voice calm and authoritative as she directed their efforts. "Sarah, have you reached your contacts?" The young FBI agent nodded, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard. "I've got a team of trusted agents on standby. They're monitoring all channels and are ready to move on our signal." "Good," Margaret replied, turning to her husband. "Robert, how's the data dump coming along?" Robert looked up from his own computer, his eyes tired but determined. "Almost there. I've set up a dead man's switch. If anything happens to us, everything we know goes public instantly. Margaret allowed herself a grim smile. It wasn't much of an insurance policy, but it was the best they could do under the circumstances. She reached into her pocket, fingers curling around the teaspoon that had become so much more than a simple utensil. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Here's the plan. When they come, and they will come, we need to hold them off long enough for Sarah's team to arrive. Robert, you'll be our last line of defense. Sarah, you're our best shot if it comes down to a firefight. I'll dash." She was cut off by a sharp crack that echoed through the night. A bullet shattered the cabin's front window, sending glass shards flying across the room. "Get down!" Sarah yelled, her training kicking in as she drew her weapon. Margaret felt Robert's arms around her, pulling her to the floor. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then all hell broke loose. The air filled with the staccato rhythm of gunfire as dark figures swarmed the cabin. Sarah returned fire, her shots precise and controlled. Robert dragged Margaret behind an overturned table, producing a small pistol from the go-bag. "Stay here," he shouted over the din. "I'll try to flank them." But Margaret had no intention of staying put. As Robert moved away, she clutched the teaspoon tightly and began to crawl towards the kitchen. If they were going to survive this, they needed every advantage they could get. In the chaos of the firefight, Margaret managed to reach the kitchen undetected. She pulled herself up to the counter, her eyes scanning desperately for anything she could use. That's when she saw it, a canister of cooking spray sitting innocuously by the stove. A plan formed in her mind, born of desperation and years of MacGyver reruns. With shaking hands, she began to work, using the teaspoon's hidden tools to modify the aerosol can. Outside the kitchen, the battle raged on. She could hear Sarah's shouts mixing with the thunder of gunfire and the crash of breaking furniture. Time was running out. Just as Margaret finished her improvised device, a dark figure appeared in the kitchen doorway. She recognized him instantly, the cold-eyed leader of the team that had attacked their home. "It's over, Mrs. Holloway," he said, his voice as icy as his gaze. "Give us the teaspoon, and we might let you live." Margaret straightened up, holding her creation behind her back. "You want the teaspoon?" she asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Come and get it." The man's lips curled into a cruel smile as he stepped forward. But Margaret was ready. In one fluid motion, she brought the modified aerosol can around and squeezed the trigger. A jet of flaming aerosol shot out, catching the attacker full in the face. He screamed, stumbling backward and crashing into his comrades who had come to back him up. Margaret didn't wait to see the results of her handiwork. She darted past the flailing, burning men, clutching her precious teaspoon. "Robert!" she yelled. "Sarah, we need to go. Now!" As if on cue, the sound of sirens filled the air. Sarah's backup had arrived. In the confusion that followed, Margaret found Robert and Sarah. Together, they slipped out the back of the cabin, running into the woods as the sounds of shouting and gunfire faded behind them. As they caught their breath in a small clearing, Robert turned to Margaret, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "A flamethrower, Maggie? Really?" Margaret shrugged, a small, fierce smile playing on her lips. "I always did tell my students that science could be exciting, but their moment of triumph was short-lived. They all knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war. The syndicate was wounded, but not defeated. And now, with their desperation at an all-time high, they would be more dangerous than ever." As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, Margaret, Robert, and Sarah shared a look of grim determination. The final confrontation was yet to come, and the fate of the nation hung in the balance. Little did they know, the key to victory lay not just in the data hidden within the teaspoon, but in the indomitable spirit of an ordinary woman thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The stage was set for a showdown that would be remembered for generations to come. The rising sun found Margaret, Robert, and Sarah huddled in a dingy motel room on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Despite their exhaustion, sleep had eluded them. The weight of what was to come pressed heavily on their shoulders. "We need to end this," Margaret said, breaking the tense silence. "Today." Robert nodded, his face etched with lines of worry and determination. "But how? The syndicate still has its tentacles deep in every level of government. We can't trust anyone." Sarah, who had been furiously working on her laptop, looked up. "Maybe we don't need to trust the government," she said. "Maybe we need to trust the people." A plan began to take shape. It was audacious, perhaps even foolhardy, but it was the best chance they had. They would take their fight to the heart of American democracy itself, the steps of the Capitol building. As they made their final preparations, Margaret clutched the teaspoon that had become so much more than a simple utensil. In it lay not just evidence of corruption, but the hopes of a nation. The journey into the city was tense, each of them keenly aware that every passing face could be an enemy. But as they approached the Capitol, something unexpected happened. People began to recognize them. It started with whispers and pointed fingers, then shouts of encouragement. By the time they reached the steps of the Capitol, a crowd had begun to form. Margaret stood at the top of the steps, Robert and Sarah flanking her on either side. She looked out at the sea of faces, curious onlookers, journalists with cameras at the ready, and yes, lurking in the shadows, agents of the syndicate. Taking a deep breath, Margaret raised the teaspoon high above her head. "People of America," she began, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "I stand before you not as a hero or a revolutionary, but as a citizen who has uncovered a truth so shocking, so fundamentally opposed to everything our great nation stands for, that I could not in good conscience keep it hidden." As Margaret spoke, laying out the extent of the syndicate's corruption, the crowd grew. People watched on their phones as her words were broadcast live across the nation. Social media exploded with reactions, hashtags trending faster than they could be tracked. But even as support for their cause swelled, danger closed in. Sharp-eyed members of the crowd spotted men in dark suits pushing their way forward, hands reaching ominously into their jackets. It was Robert who saw the glint of metal first. "Gun!" he shouted, throwing himself in front of Margaret. The crack of a gunshot rang out, sending the crowd into panic. But in that moment of chaos, something remarkable happened. Ordinary citizens, men and women who moments ago had been passive observers, moved to protect Margaret and her companions. A human shield formed around them, people linking arms and standing firm against the encroaching threat. Shouts of "We stand with Holloway" and "No more secrets" rose from the crowd. Overwhelmed by the unexpected resistance, the syndicate's agents faltered. And in that moment of hesitation, Sarah's FBI backup finally arrived, swarming the area and taking control. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Margaret found herself at the center of a media storm. Microphones were thrust in her face, cameras flashed from every angle. But she had eyes only for Robert, who stood beside her, a little battered but very much alive. "We did it," she whispered, squeezing his hand. Robert smiled, the relief evident in his eyes. "No, Maggie, you did it." In the days that followed, the full extent of the syndicate's corruption came to light. High-ranking officials were arrested, shadowy organizations were exposed, and a process of healing and reform began for the nation. Margaret and Robert, no longer forced to live in the shadows, found themselves hailed as unlikely heroes. There were talks of book deals, movie rights, even a presidential medal of freedom. But for Margaret, the greatest reward was much simpler. One quiet evening, as they sat on the porch of their old home, now restored and protected by round-the-clock security, Margaret turned to her husband. "You know," she said, a mischievous twinkle in her eye, "I think I might miss all the excitement." Robert chuckled, pulling her close. "Somehow, Maggie, I don't think our adventures are quite over yet." As if on cue, Sarah's car pulled into the driveway. The young FBI agent, now heading a new task force dedicated to rooting out corruption, had a familiar look of urgency on her face. Margaret and Robert shared a knowing glance. It seemed that retirement would have to wait a little longer. But as long as they were together, facing whatever challenges came their way with nothing more than their wits, their love, and perhaps a certain special teaspoon, they knew they could handle anything. After all, they were the Holloways, and their greatest adventure was just beginning. Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.